When I was watching TV in the living room, my son-in-law said, "This is our house now. Go to your room." My daughter was silent. I quietly got up and left. 2 days later, the bank called them. "Your house has been seized." Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I built that house with my own hands. Not literally, of course, but in every way that mattered. My husband Gerald and I had saved for 11 years to buy it. 11 years of skipped vacations, secondhand cars, and store-brand everything. We signed the papers in October of 1987, and I cried in the driveway because I couldn't believe something so solid and permanent could belong to people like us. Working people, honest people, people who had never once been handed anything for free. Gerald passed in 2009. Prostate cancer. Slow and cruel the way that disease tends to be. He died in the bedroom on the second floor, the one with the window that looked out over the oak tree we'd planted together the summer our daughter Renee turned 5. After the funeral, I stayed in that house because leaving would have felt like dying twice. Every corner of it held him. The coffee ring on the kitchen counter I never scrubbed away. The indent in the armchair where he used to read. The house wasn't just property. It was memory, made into walls and floors and ceilings. Renee was 41 when she asked if she and her husband could move in with me. She said it was temporary. Marcus had lost his job. The apartment lease was ending. They needed a few months to get back on their feet. She said it with that voice she'd had since childhood, soft and slightly wounded. The voice she used when she needed something and already suspected I might say no. I didn't say no. I never said no to Renee. She was my only child, and the house had felt too quiet since Gerald died. They moved in on a Saturday in March. Marcus arrived driving a truck that looked newer than anything I'd ever owned. He was a tall man with an easy smile and restless eyes. The kind of eyes that are always measuring things, calculating distances. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was just a 67-year-old woman who had lived alone too long and had forgotten how to share space. The first weeks were fine. More than fine, actually. Renee cooked dinner 3 times a week, and we watched old movies together on Friday nights. Marcus was polite, if distant. He called me ma'am and thanked me for meals and fixed the leaking pipe under the kitchen sink without being asked. I thought, perhaps I misjudged him. Perhaps this will be good for all of us. But small things began to accumulate, the way small things always do before they become large things. Marcus started referring to the house as our place. Not to me, to other people. I overheard him on the phone one afternoon saying, "Yeah, come by our place on Sunday?" I stood in the hallway and felt something cold move through my chest. It was probably nothing, a slip of the tongue. People say our place without thinking. Then he began rearranging the living room. He moved Gerald's armchair to the corner where no one sits, and replaced it with a leather recliner he'd ordered online. When I asked him about it, he said the living room needed better flow. He said it pleasantly, with that easy smile. I moved Gerald's chair back the next morning. It was back in the corner by evening. Renee watched all of this and said nothing. That was its own kind of message. The incident that I still think about, the one that changed everything, that made me understand exactly what was happening in my own home, occurred on an ordinary Tuesday evening in November, 8 months after they'd moved in. I was in the living room, sitting in Gerald's armchair, watching the evening news. My feet were up on the small ottoman I'd had for 30 years. The lamp beside me cast its warm circle of light. It was my chair, in my house, in my room, and I was sitting in it the way I had sat in it for decades. Marcus walked in, looked at me, and said it plainly. Not cruelly, not with anger, which somehow made it worse. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided is simply true. "This is our house now, go to your room." I looked at him. I looked at Renee, who was standing in the doorway to the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands. She looked at the floor. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I set down the remote control, placed my feet on the floor, stood up slowly, and walked to my bedroom. I closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and I thought, is this what my life has become? Is this what Gerald's house has become? And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something sharpen inside me. Something old and quiet and absolutely certain. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and I listened to the house, my house, the way you listen to something you are afraid of losing. The furnace hummed. A car passed on the street outside. Somewhere downstairs, Marcus laughed at something on television. His laugh was loud and easy, the laugh of a man who feels entirely at home. That was the word that kept returning to me as I lay there staring at the ceiling. Home. Whose home? Who had lived here for 34 years? Who had painted these walls, chosen these floors, planted that oak tree outside? Whose name was on the deed? In the morning, I made myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table before either of them woke up. I needed quiet. I needed to think clearly, and I knew that the moment they came downstairs, the clarity would be harder to hold on to. Marcus had a way of filling a room that made other people feel smaller. I had noticed it for months without naming it. Now I was naming it. I took out a legal pad. I've always done my thinking on paper, and I began to write. First, I listed what I knew. The house was mine. Gerald and I had purchased it jointly, and when he died, the deed transferred to me alone. I had never added Renee's name to the deed. I had never added Marcus's name. They were tenants in the legal sense and not even paying tenants. They had moved in under the understanding that they were guests. Temporary guests. 8 months had passed. Second, I listed what had changed. They had begun receiving mail at this address. Official mail, not just catalogs. Renee had given the address to her employer for her W-2. Marcus had listed it as his residence on some form he'd left on the counter. They had replaced furniture. They had begun hosting their friends here without asking. And now Marcus had told me, in my own living room, to go to my room. Third, I listed what I was afraid of. I wrote it honestly, because fear deserves to be written down and looked at directly rather than avoided. I was afraid of losing Renee. She was my daughter, difficult, passive, sometimes weak in ways that broke my heart, but mine. I was afraid that if I acted, she would choose him over me, and I would lose both my daughter and my home. I was afraid of being 67 years old and starting a legal battle I didn't fully understand. I was afraid of looking foolish or vindictive or like a bitter old woman who couldn't share her space. But then I wrote one more thing at the bottom of the page. I underlined it twice. If I do nothing, I will lose the house anyway, and I will have lost it quietly without a fight, which is the only way of losing that I cannot forgive myself for. I put down the pen and drank my coffee, which had gone cold. That afternoon, while Renee was at work and Marcus was supposedly job hunting, a process that appeared to involve a great deal of time on the couch, I drove to the county records office. It took me 20 minutes to find parking and another 15 minutes to locate the right window. But I stood there patiently, and I asked the young woman behind the desk to confirm the current owner of record for my address. She typed. She looked at her screen. She said, Margaret Louise Calloway. Is that you? Yes, I said. That's me. I asked for a certified copy of the deed. It cost $11. I drove home with it in a manila envelope on the passenger seat, and I felt, for the first time in months, as though the ground under my feet was solid again. That evening, I called my friend Dorothy, who had been through a difficult divorce 10 years earlier and knew things about property law that most people don't. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. But I asked her a careful question. I asked, if someone has been living in your home for 8 months without paying rent and without a lease, what are their legal rights? Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in this state, Margaret, they could try to claim tenant status. You'd need to formally establish a landlord-tenant relationship or formally dissolve one. Either way, you'd want an attorney. I thanked her and hung up. I sat by the window in my bedroom, in my house, and I watched the oak tree in the fading light. Gerald had planted that tree. Marcus had not planted anything. He had arrived and assumed ownership of things that had been built by other hands over a lifetime. The plan began to form then, piece by piece, the way a plan forms when you have finally, stopped being afraid long enough to think. I would need an attorney. I would need documentation. I would need to act carefully, legally, and quietly enough that they would not realize what was happening until it was too late for them to do anything about it. I picked up the legal pad again. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote, Step 1. The attorney's name was Patricia Holt. Dorothy had recommended her, a woman in her mid-50s, sharp and direct, with an office on Clement Street that smelled of good coffee and old books. I liked her immediately. She didn't waste my time with sympathy, which I appreciated. She listened, took notes, asked precise questions, and when I was done speaking, she folded her hands on the desk and told me exactly what I needed to hear. You're in a better position than you think, she said. The property is solely in your name. There is no lease agreement, written or verbal, that establishes tenancy with enforceable rights. However, because they've been residing there for over 6 months and receiving official correspondence at that address, they may attempt to claim informal tenant status under state law. We need to move carefully and document everything. She told me the first step was to send a formal notice to quit, a legal document establishing that I was requiring them to vacate the property. Under state law, since there was no lease, I was required to give 30 days' notice. She would draft it. I would sign it. It would be sent via certified mail and hand-delivered, creating an unambiguous legal record. Once that notice is served, Patricia said, the clock starts. They will have 30 days to leave voluntarily. If they don't, we file for eviction. I asked her the question I had been carrying since the night I sat in the dark in my bedroom. Can they fight it? They can try, she said. Marcus in particular may try to argue common law tenancy or challenge the notice on procedural grounds. That's why we do this precisely. No shortcuts. I signed the retainer agreement that afternoon. I drove home feeling something I had not expected. Not relief exactly, but alignment. The sensation of my decisions catching up with my convictions. Over the following week, I was careful. I behaved at home exactly as I normally behaved. I made coffee in the morning. I watched the news. I asked Renee about her day. I did not argue with Marcus when he changed the thermostat to a temperature I found too warm. I was watching, and I was documenting. Patricia had told me to keep a written log. Dates. Times. Specific incidents. I kept it in a small notebook I stored in my coat pocket, but they noticed something. I am not certain what gave it away. Perhaps I was too calm, or perhaps Marcus was simply the kind of man who sensed resistance the way some animals sense weather. One evening at dinner, he looked at me over the table with those measuring eyes and said, "You seem different lately, Margaret." I smiled pleasantly. "Do I?" "I'm sleeping better," I said. "I've been taking walks." He held my gaze a moment too long. Then he picked up his fork. Renee said nothing. She always said nothing. The evidence came to me not as a dramatic discovery, but as a piece of paper on the kitchen counter. I found it on a Wednesday morning, after Marcus had left. Not for a job interview, I suspected, but to meet his friend Kevin, whom he saw several times a week. It was a bank document, half folded, left carelessly beside the fruit bowl. I almost didn't pick it up. Then I did. It was a loan application. Marcus had applied and been pre-approved for a home equity line of credit. The collateral listed on the application was my house, my address, my property. I stood in the kitchen for a very long time, holding that piece of paper. He hadn't been able to access the equity, of course. He wasn't on the deed. The bank would have required my signature, my consent, my documentation. But the application itself, the fact that he had attempted it, that he had listed my home as an asset he intended to borrow against, told me everything I needed to know about what Marcus believed his position in this house to be. He thought he was already the owner in every way that mattered. He was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I took a photograph of the document with my phone. I placed the document back on the counter in exactly the same position I had found it. I went to my bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and texted Patricia a single message. "I have something you need to see." That afternoon, I drove to her office. She looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at me. "This is fraudulent misrepresentation," she said quietly. "He listed your property as collateral without your knowledge or consent. That's not just aggressive. It's potentially criminal." "What do we do with it?" I asked. "We keep it," she said, "and we accelerate our timeline." The notice to quit was ready by Friday. Patricia arranged for it to be hand-delivered by a process server on Saturday morning, while both Renee and Marcus were home. Certified mail went out the same day to create a double record. I was in my bedroom when the process server knocked on the door. I heard Marcus answer it. I heard the brief exchange of words. I heard the door close. And then I heard Marcus say very quietly, but with a fury that carried up the stairs, "What the hell is this?" There was no going back now, nor did I want there to be. The next hour was the loudest my house had been since Gerald's funeral. Marcus came upstairs. I heard the heavy, deliberate sound of his footsteps on the stairs, each one like a statement. And he knocked on my bedroom door. Not lightly. He knocked the way people knock when they intend the knock itself to be a message. I opened the door. I was wearing my cardigan and holding my reading glasses. I looked at him calmly. He was holding the notice to quit in his right hand, slightly crumpled because he had been gripping it hard. His face was controlled, but only just. I could see the effort it required. His jaw was tight. His eyes had lost their easy quality entirely. "What is this?" he said. "It's a legal document," I said. "It explains the situation clearly. I'd encourage you to read it carefully." I read it. He took one step closer. "You're evicting us? Your own daughter?" "I am asking you both to vacate my property," I said, "within the 30-day period required by law." He stared at me. I could see him recalibrating, reassessing this woman he had underestimated for 8 months. Good. Let him reassess. "You think you can just—" He stopped, switched approaches the way a man does when he realizes anger is not going to work. His voice dropped. "Margaret, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this isn't the way families handle things. You're upsetting Renee. You're going to destroy your relationship with your daughter over—" "What? You want the living room to yourself?" "This isn't about the living room," I said. "Then what is it about?" "It's about my house," I said simply. Which is mine? Renee appeared at the top of the stairs. She had been crying. I could see it in the redness around her eyes. She looked at me with an expression I recognized from her childhood, that particular combination of accusation and appeal. How could you? Please don't. Mom, she said, please. We can talk about this. You don't need to involve lawyers. I do, I said. I should have involved one some months ago. Marcus's voice changed again, softer now, and precisely because it was softer, more frightening. You need to understand something, Margaret. If you push this, you will regret it. I know people at the county assessor's office. I know how these disputes go. You're an elderly woman living alone. Courts don't always side with. Are you threatening me? I said. He smiled, and it was the first time I had seen his smile for what it was. I'm advising you, he said. I looked at him steadily. I'd like you to leave my doorway now, I said. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something almost like uncertainty. He hadn't expected this. He had expected tears, or bargaining, or retreat. He stepped back. He turned and went downstairs without another word. Renee stood at the top of the stairs looking at me. Mom? You can talk to Patricia Holt, I said gently. She can answer your questions. Her number is on the notice. I closed my bedroom door. The following days were an exercise in sustained pressure. Marcus tried twice more to engage me directly, once presenting what he called a compromise, which amounted to them staying indefinitely in exchange for Marcus eventually doing home improvements, and once enlisting a friend of his, a man named Dale, who seemed to believe that speaking loudly and confidently was equivalent to speaking legally. Dale informed me that I had created a hostile living situation, and that they might have grounds to countersue. I thanked Dale for his perspective and suggested he speak to my attorney. I also called Patricia and reported every exchange, dates, and details, which she added to the file. On day 12 of the 30-day period, a letter arrived from a debt collection agency addressed to Marcus at my address regarding a credit card account that was 6 months in arrears. 2 days after that, a call came to the house landline, which Marcus had apparently given out as his contact number, from a company pursuing an unpaid personal loan. The picture was becoming clearer. When the 30 days ended without them vacating, Patricia filed the eviction papers with the court. I was in her office when she did it, and I watched her submit the documents with the steady, methodical calm of someone who had done this many times and had no doubt about the outcome. After I left her office, I drove to the beach. It was cold, early February, and there was almost no one on the sand. I sat on a bench and watched the water for a long time. I thought about Gerald, who had always said that the ocean was the best argument against self-importance. I thought about what I had set in motion and what it would cost and what it would reclaim. I was tired, not weakened. Tired in the honest way you are tired after you have done something real and difficult and necessary. I gave myself 3 days. I told no one where I was going. I drove to a small motel 2 hours north in a town Gerald and I had loved, and I sat by the window and read novels and ordered soup from the diner next door and slept for 9 hours each night. No phone calls. No conflict. Just rest. When I came back, I was ready. I returned on a Thursday afternoon to find the house exactly as I had left it, occupied, slightly too warm, and carrying that particular tension of people who are waiting to see what you will do next. Marcus was on the couch when I came through the front door. He looked up at me with an expression that was almost casual, as though he had arranged his face specifically to suggest that nothing about my return concerned him. He was good at that. I had to give him that much. Nice vacation, he said. Very restful, I said. I took off my coat, hung it in the front closet, and went to the kitchen to put on coffee. Renee came downstairs a few minutes later. She moved carefully, the way people move when they aren't sure what mood they're walking into. She looked thinner than she had 3 weeks ago, I noticed. Stress had always gone straight to her frame, even as a child. "Mom," she said, "I'm glad you're back. I was worried." "There's no need to worry about me," I said. "Coffee?" She sat at the table while I made it, and for a few minutes, it was almost like the early days when we'd sat together in the mornings before Marcus came down. Almost. She tried the soft approach. I had expected it. She told me she understood I had felt disrespected. She used that word, disrespected, carefully as though it had been chosen and rehearsed, and that Marcus had not meant it the way it sounded. She said he was under a lot of pressure with the job situation. She said she loved me. She said, couldn't we find a way to resolve this without courts? I listened to all of it. I poured her coffee and set it in front of her and looked at her. Really looked at her. With the particular kind of attention you can only give someone you have loved since before they could walk. "Renee," I said, "I love you. That isn't what's on the table here. What's on the table is a legal process that is already in motion. If you and Marcus find a new place to live within the court's timeline, this ends simply. If you don't, it becomes more complicated for everyone." She stared into her coffee. I knew that expression. She was hoping I would fill the silence. I did not. 2 days later, Marcus tried a different approach entirely. I was in the backyard. It was an unusually warm February afternoon, and I was trimming the rosebush that had survived 17 winters against that back fence. When he came out and sat in the patio chair and folded his hands and looked at me with what I can only describe as practiced sincerity. He said he'd found a job prospect in Phoenix. He said things had been hard and he'd made mistakes. He said the comment in the living room, "Go to your room," was something he deeply regretted, and that he hoped I could find it in my heart to give them 1 more month, just one, so that he could finalize the Phoenix opportunity and move Renee somewhere they could build something real. It was a good performance, genuinely good. He had warm eyes when he chose to use them that way. "If the Phoenix position comes through," I said, still trimming the rosebush without looking at him, "that's wonderful for you both. The court timeline gives you the space to pursue it. I hope it works out." He waited. When I said nothing more, he went inside. The support I needed came from 3 places. Dorothy came over on a Friday with a bottle of wine and 3 hours of company, and she sat across from me in the living room, in Gerald's chair, which I had moved back to its proper place. And she let me talk through all of it without offering opinions I hadn't asked for. That is a rare and valuable quality in a friend. My neighbor Ray, who was 72 and had lived next door for 20 years, and had always kept a careful eye on the neighborhood in the way that older men who have worked in law enforcement tend to do, told me that he had noticed the volume and frequency of visitors to my home over the past months. He offered, without my asking, to write a statement documenting what he had observed. I thanked him and passed his contact information to Patricia. And Patricia herself, when I called her that week, said something I held on to. She said, "Margaret, I have handled dozens of cases like this. I have never seen one where the rightful owner lost, provided they stayed the course." Stay the course. I was staying the course. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of March. I marked it in my calendar in red ink, the way I used to mark Renee's school performances and Gerald's doctor appointments, the things that mattered and required my full presence. Marcus watched me from across rooms. He was calculating something. I could feel it. He wasn't done. But neither was I. They came to my bedroom door together on a Sunday evening, 10 days before the court hearing. I heard them talking in low voices in the hallway first. the sound of two people coordinating, deciding on approach, which told me that whatever was about to happen had been planned. Renee knocked. "Mom, can we come in? We'd like to talk." I was reading. I put down my book, marked the page, and said, "Come in." They both entered, which was unusual. Marcus almost never came into my bedroom. It was perhaps the one space he had consistently treated as mine. He stood near the door while Renee sat in the chair by the window, the small, upholstered chair I'd had since Renee was in high school. She was holding a folder. "We want to start over," Renee said. Her voice was steady, rehearsed, but sincere in the way that someone can be sincere and still following a script. "We've done a lot of thinking. We've talked to a counselor actually this week, and we realize that Marcus in particular, haven't shown you the respect you deserve in your own home." Marcus, near the door, nodded. "I owe you an apology, Margaret. What I said to you, in the living room, back in November, that was wrong. I was wrong. I've been carrying a lot of shame about it." He said it well. I noticed he made eye contact. I noticed he did not move closer to the chair, did not make himself too physically present, which would have read as aggression. He stayed near the door. Deferential. This had been thought through. Renee opened the folder. She placed a document on the bed beside me. It was a proposed written agreement, not drafted by an attorney, but typed up carefully, and it outlined a new arrangement. They would pay rent, a modest monthly amount, and would take on specific household responsibilities. There was language about mutual respect and communication. There was a clause buried in the middle that described the arrangement as a long-term residential agreement. There it was. It was well constructed. I had to acknowledge that. The entire presentation was designed to give me what I wanted emotionally: the apology, the acknowledgement, the restoration of dignity, while simultaneously converting their precarious informal position into something with legal weight. Long-term residential agreement. If I had signed it, I would have voluntarily created the very tenant relationship that Patricia was working to establish didn't exist. I read it carefully. I read it all the way to the end while they waited. Renee was watching my face with the focused attention of a woman who had prepared for several possible reactions. Marcus had shifted his weight once, slightly. The only tell that his patience was not as settled as his posture suggested. Then I set it down on the nightstand, next to Gerald's photograph. I let my hand rest there for a moment, just briefly, on the edge of the frame. "I appreciate this," I said. "I appreciate the apology. I mean that genuinely." I looked at Marcus. "I believe some part of what you said is sincere." He began to speak. I continued. "But I'm not going to sign this agreement. The process that's currently underway, now the legal process, is going to continue to its conclusion." The room changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The way a room changes when the possibility of a negotiated outcome closes off. Renee's face fell in a way that wasn't grief exactly, but its cousin. Frustration at the failure of a strategy. Marcus changed more visibly. His posture shifted. Not to aggression, not yet, but something dropped away. The careful, rehearsed quality disappeared, and what replaced it was something more unguarded, and therefore more revealing. "You realize what you're doing to your daughter," he said. Not a question, a statement, flat and pointed. "Renee is an adult," I said. "Her situation is the result of choices that were made over many months." "You're an old woman alone in a house," he said, and his voice had changed again, shed the rehearsed warmth, dropped to something harder. "What happens when you need help? When something goes wrong? Who's going to be there?" I took a slow breath. It was the oldest trick available to him, the implication that my age made me a problem to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. I had been waiting for it, actually. People like Marcus always circle back to it eventually, because they believe it to be the one lever that cannot be argued away. They are wrong about that. I have good neighbors and good friends and a good attorney, I said. Is there something else you'd like to discuss? He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that I couldn't entirely name. Anger, certainly, but underneath it, something that might have been genuine bewilderment. He had known how to handle a frightened, grieving widow. He did not quite know how to handle this. You'll hear from our lawyer, he said. I look forward to it, I said. Good night. They left. I heard them arguing downstairs, not the words, just the tones. Renee's voice pleading and Marcus's voice clipped and hard. After a while, the house went quiet. I sat in the stillness. I won't pretend I felt nothing. There was fear, a thin, cold thread of it running through my chest. Marcus was not a man without resources or without the willingness to use them unpleasantly. The hearing was 10 days away. Anything could still happen. But the fear, when I examined it honestly, was not stronger than the other thing I felt. It was an old word for an old feeling, a feeling I associated with Gerald, with 11 years of saving for this house, with watching Renee take her first steps on these floors. The word was mine. I picked up my book and found my page. The courthouse was on a quiet street downtown, the kind of building that has a certain specific gravity to it, heavy with the weight of other people's urgent matters. I arrived 20 minutes early, wearing the dark blue blazer I had bought the year Gerald and I celebrated our 30th anniversary. I don't know why I chose it that morning, perhaps because it was the blazer I associated with occasions that required my best self. I had slept well the night before. I want to note that, because it surprised me. I had expected to lie awake rehearsing arguments, running through worst-case scenarios. Instead, I had read for an hour, set down my book, and slept straight through until 6 in the morning. When I woke, I lay still for a moment and listened to the house, and it occurred to me that the house sounded like itself. The particular settling sounds of a structure that had been standing for 34 years. Familiar, solid, mine. Patricia was already there, at the table to the left, with 2 folders and a yellow legal pad. She looked up when I sat down beside her and said, without preamble, "We're prepared. Don't speak unless I indicate. If the judge addresses you directly, answer briefly and truthfully." I know, I said. I'm not nervous. She looked at me for a moment. I believe you, she said. Marcus and Renee arrived with the attorney Marcus had retained, a man named Caldwell, whose suit was expensive and whose manner was that particular variety of aggressive confidence I associated with men who rarely face consequences. He spoke briefly with Marcus near the door, and I saw Marcus straighten in the way people straighten when they're bolstering themselves before something they know will be difficult. He was dressed carefully, a collared shirt, a blazer, the deliberate presentation of a respectable man making a reasonable case. I recognized the effort. I had made similar efforts myself in the weeks leading up to this morning. Renee sat down without looking at me. She was pale and had her hands folded in her lap and was staring at a fixed point on the wall ahead of her. She looked very young. She had always looked very young when she was frightened. I felt the grief of that. The old, insoluble grief of a mother watching her child make her own choices. And I let it move through me, and I did not let it move my hands. The hearing began. It was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. No revelations shouted across a courtroom, no sudden confessions. Eviction hearings are largely procedural, but procedures, when your documentation is in order and your opponent's is not, are their own kind of drama. Caldwell argued that his clients had established informal tenancy through sustained residence, receipt of official mail, and a contribution to the household. Contribution he defined loosely as Marcus's repair of the kitchen pipe and other minor improvements. He argued that the notice to quit had been served in a retaliatory manner, following what he called a minor interpersonal dispute. He used the phrase elderly woman living alone twice, and both times I held his gaze steadily across the room until he moved on. Patricia presented our documentation methodically. The original deed in my name alone, the absence of any lease or rental agreement, the log of incidents I had kept, the certified mail receipts, Ray's written statement, and the photograph of Marcus's loan application, which listed my property as collateral without my knowledge or consent. When the loan application photograph appeared as evidence, something happened to Marcus that I had not expected and will not forget. He had been sitting with his arms crossed, maintaining the posture of a man who is merely tolerating a procedural inconvenience. When Caldwell passed the photograph to him to review, I watched Marcus's face go through several rapid changes in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. Surprise. Genuine, unguarded surprise that this document had made its way into a courtroom. Then a kind of arrested blankness. Then, and this is the thing that told me everything, this single flash, a look directed at Renee, swift and sharp, the look of a man checking whether his accomplice is holding steady. Renee was not looking at him. She was looking at the photograph. And her expression was not the expression of a woman seeing something she already knew about. She hadn't known about the loan application. He hadn't told her. He had been attempting to leverage her mother's property for his own purposes without telling his own wife. The judge asked Marcus directly whether he had submitted the loan application. Caldwell interjected that it was an exploratory inquiry and that the judge repeated the question to Marcus. Marcus said yes, he had submitted it, but that his understanding was that as a long-term resident he had— The judge held up one hand. The silence in the courtroom after that was the most complete silence I have ever heard in a room containing several people. I counted 4 full seconds of it. Caldwell looked down at his notepad. Marcus looked at the table. Renee looked at nothing. When the judge spoke again, he spoke with the measured, formal certainty of someone who has heard many stories and identified this one's essential nature without difficulty. He noted the absence of any formal tenancy agreement. He noted the unauthorized loan application. He noted the sustained, documented pattern of behavior I had recorded. He noted that no evidence had been produced to support the claim of established informal tenancy to the threshold required under state law. He noted, in terms that I thought were admirably precise, that Marcus's characterization of himself as a long-term resident with property rights was not supported by a single document in the record. He ruled in my favor. Judgment for the plaintiff. That was me, Margaret Louise Calloway. On all counts. Marcus and Renee were ordered to vacate the property within 14 days. Legal costs were awarded to my side. I sat and listened to all of this with my hands folded on the table and my breathing slow. Patricia put her hand briefly on my arm. Across the room, Marcus stood up too quickly, and his chair scraped against the floor. Caldwell put a hand on his arm. Marcus shook it off. He said something to Caldwell in a low, tight voice that I could not hear. Then he looked across the room at me. And for the first time, I saw that Marcus was afraid. Not the calculating, performative concern he had deployed at my bedroom door. Something real and unmanaged. The easy smile was entirely gone. What remained was just a man who had miscalculated, standing in a room that had run out of exits. Renee was still sitting. She was looking at the table. She did not look at him. She did not look at me. Her hands, folded in her lap since the beginning of the hearing, had not moved once. On the drive home, I stopped at the cemetery where Gerald is buried. I don't do it often. Grief doesn't require regular scheduling. But that day, I felt I owed him a visit. I stood at his stone for a few minutes in the cold, clear air. A cardinal landed briefly on the branch of a nearby tree, bright as a signal, then was gone. We kept the house, I said. The 14 days that followed the hearing were the strangest of the entire ordeal, a period of action and aftermath existing simultaneously, like a storm that keeps producing weather even as it begins to break apart. Marcus began making calls the morning after the hearing. I knew because I could hear him through the thin wall that separated the back bedroom from the hallway, his voice cycling through the same patterns. Tight and controlled, then persuasive, then increasingly frustrated. He was calling Caldwell, apparently exploring grounds for appeal. He was calling someone named Garrett, who seemed to be a mutual acquaintance with some tangential connection to the property industry. He was calling a friend in Phoenix about the job prospect that had apparently not yet materialized. I went about my days without altering my routine. I made my coffee. I tended the rose bush. I called Dorothy. There was a temptation, which I resisted, to hover near their activity, to monitor progress. But that was not my task. My task was to hold steady and let the process do its work. Patricia had told me once that the hardest part of winning a legal matter is the period immediately after the ruling, when the other side is still in motion, and you have to resist the urge to interfere. I took her at her word. Renee moved through the house quietly. She had stopped meeting my eyes. On the third day, she knocked on my door and came in without Marcus and sat in the chair by the window and looked at her hands for a long time before she said anything. "He applied for that loan without telling me," she finally said. "I know," I said. "I didn't know he'd done that." She looked up. Her eyes were very red. "Mom, I want you to know I didn't know." "I believe you," I said. And I did. Renee had many failings, but they were the failings of a woman who avoided conflict rather than the failings of a woman who schemed. She had closed her eyes when she should have kept them open. That was her sin, not a small one, but a different one from her husband's. "I don't know who he is," she said quietly. It wasn't dramatic when she said it. It was flat and tired, which made it more real. "You'll figure that out," I said. I meant it kindly. I moved to the chair beside her and put my hand over hers, and we sat there in my bedroom, for a few minutes without speaking. Outside the window, the oak tree moved slightly in the wind, and the late afternoon light came through in long, pale bars across the floor. The same light that had come through that window for 34 years. On day 7, Marcus retained a new attorney and filed a motion to delay enforcement of the judgment pending appeal. Patricia responded within 48 hours with documentation that comprehensively dismantled every procedural argument in the motion. The new attorney, apparently having reviewed the full case file, including the loan application, withdrew from the representation within the week. No appeal was filed. I learned from Patricia that the withdrawal had been immediate and unambiguous. The attorney had sent a 1-paragraph letter citing irreconcilable differences of professional opinion. In the 8 months I had known Patricia, that was the only time I heard her laugh on the phone. On day 9, a certified letter arrived at my address from the bank that had processed Marcus's equity loan application. The letter was addressed to Marcus, and I did not open it. But 2 days later, another letter arrived, addressed to me, from the same bank's legal affairs department. The bank, it transpired, had conducted its own review of the application after being alerted by the court proceedings. They had determined that Marcus had submitted documentation containing materially false statements about his relationship to the property. They were referring the matter to their fraud investigation unit. I photographed the letter and sent it to Patricia. She called me within the hour. "This is beyond the eviction now, Margaret. This is potential bank fraud. That's a separate matter, and it's in their hands, but it's significant." "Yes," I said. "How are you feeling about all of it?" I thought about the question honestly, the way she had always encouraged me to think about things. "Settled," I said at last. "I feel settled." On day 13, Marcus's car was gone from the driveway when I woke up in the morning. He left without ceremony, without speaking to me, without any of the dramatic final confrontation I had half expected from a man who had performed confidence so thoroughly for so many months. He simply was there, and then he wasn't. In the end, he departed the same way he had arrived, in a truck that was newer than anything I'd ever owned, except this time there was no easy smile, no hand extended in greeting. Renee was still there. I could hear her moving around in the back bedroom. She came downstairs that afternoon with 2 suitcases and a look of complete exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who has spent a long time holding something together that could not hold. She hugged me at the front door. She held on for a long moment, the way she used to hold on when she was little and had been frightened by something in a dream. I held her back. I pressed my hand to the back of her head the way I had when she was small. I felt her exhale. "I'll call," she said. "I know," I said. She put her suitcases in her car and drove away. I stood in the doorway and watched until the car turned the corner and disappeared. The street was quiet. A neighbor's dog barked twice somewhere down the block, then stopped. The house was quiet, the right kind of quiet. Not the hollow quiet of absence, but the settled quiet of a space returning to itself after a disruption. I went back inside. I moved Gerald's chair back from the corner, back to its proper place beside the lamp. I sat in it. I picked up the remote control. I turned on the news. I put my feet on the ottoman. Marcus's new life began its unraveling almost immediately, in the way that lives built on accumulating shortcuts tend to unravel when the shortcuts run out. The Phoenix job had not materialized and, I later learned from Dorothy, had perhaps never existed in the form Marcus had described it. He had sublet a room from a friend, the man named Kevin I'd heard him mention. And within 6 weeks, that arrangement fell apart over unpaid rent. The bank fraud investigation was ongoing. His credit, already strained, collapsed under the weight of his various outstanding debts. The county records office sent me a routine notification. Someone had attempted an inquiry on my property title, denied because my name had been flagged by the court. Whoever had made the inquiry, and I had a reasonable suspicion, had found a wall where they had expected an opening. I called Patricia to thank her. She said what she always said, that I had done the work, she'd just filed the paperwork. Maybe. But the paperwork matters. The documentation matters. Standing your ground in your own house, in your own chair, with your feet on your own ottoman, that matters too. Spring came early that year, or perhaps it simply felt that way because I was paying attention again. I repainted the living room in April. A warm cream color that Gerald had always liked and that Marcus had once suggested replacing with gray. I rehung every photograph in its proper place. I moved the leather recliner to the garage sale I held in May and watched a young couple carry it off for $35 while I sat on the porch with my coffee. Dorothy came for dinner on alternating Fridays. Ray and his wife Carol joined us occasionally, and those evenings settled into the easy rhythm of people comfortable with silence as well as conversation. I cooked things I hadn't made in years. Gerald's mother's pot roast, a lemon cake that took the better part of an afternoon, I took a trip in June, a week in a small coastal town in Maine that Gerald and I had visited on our honeymoon. I stayed in a bed and breakfast run by a woman named Helen who had renovated the place herself over a decade. We had coffee on the porch each morning and talked about the education that comes from doing difficult things without giving up. I thought about Renee every day. The victory over Marcus had not cost me my love for my daughter, and the love for my daughter had not cost me the victory. Both things were true simultaneously, which is the uncomfortable nature of most real things. She called in July from an apartment in a neighboring city. She'd gone back to work full-time, a job she'd held before the marriage. She sounded clearer. We talked for an hour. She asked if she could come for Christmas. I said yes. Marcus's situation continued to deteriorate. The bank fraud investigation was referred to the district attorney's office by late summer. Kevin, the friend whose room he'd been subletting, had asked him to leave. By autumn, he was living in a motel 2 hours away, working a job several rungs below what he'd once called his floor. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. What I felt was quieter. Cause and consequence aligning in the slow, reliable way I had always believed they did. The oak tree was magnificent that fall. I sat under it one afternoon and thought about the notebook in my coat pocket, the morning at the kitchen table, the words I had written and underlined twice. If I do nothing, I will lose the house anyway. The house was mine. It had always been mine. The difference was that I had stopped apologizing for the ground I was standing on. Gerald would have been proud, not for winning, but for the manner of it. Careful, legal, patient. I closed my book and watched the light through the leaves of our tree. It was a very good afternoon. So that's the story. My house, my chair, my ground. Here is what I learned. Documentation is not paranoia. It is preparation. Quiet people are not passive people. And the moment someone tells you to leave your own room, that is not a moment for negotiation. That is a moment for clarity. I was 67 years old. I was afraid. I was also, ultimately, right. Those two things can coexist. If someone told you, in your own home, built by your own hands, to go to your room, what would you have done? I hope you would have made a plan. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you.